Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. In this video, we're going to do part 3, and probably the final part, of Little Blue Book, number 1030, titled The World's Great Religions, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1920s. So, this is what the world's great religions were, 1920s. Alright, here we go. We're going to start off, chapter 5. The Ancient American Religions. I approached this chapter from a pilgrimage to the shrines of the ancient Mexicans. I have marveled at the stately remains of Teotihuacan, the vast ruins of Chichen Itza and Uxmal, and the wonderful work at Mitla and the pyramids of Chochula and Saraveka. When at least a tithe of these American treasures have been bared to the sun once more, and the story is put together of the march of the Americans from Alaska to Yucatan and Peru, it will probably be one of the most thrilling pages of the human chronicle. But these highest representatives of the American population were imperfectly civilized. Their religions had, in most cases, barbaric features. Contact of different cultures is, as I said, the mainspring of the progress, and in America there were only peoples of the same stock. What they did in the circumstances is wonderful, and their religious developments, the very heart of their lives, must be included here. There is very little room for doubt that this Indian population of America, which means the entire pre-Columbian population, except a few tribes in the south, came from Asia via Alaska, sometime after the close of the Great Ice Age, probably between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. American archaeologists justly reject the idea of some European scholars that culture was brought to them in some mysterious way from Egypt. There is nothing whatever in the Egyptian remains to suggest that the kingdom ever expanded in such an extraordinary fashion, and if the pyramids of Mexico, the pedestals of temples, have some superficial resemblance to the pyramids of Egypt, the hieroglyphics are so radically different that no scholar can decipher them except the numbers, and the religions and other features differ fundamentally. America developed its own civilizations, and luckily today I believe we can read the hieroglyphics of the Aztecs and Mayans, but not in the 1920s. From the northwest, the Americans poured over the whole continent, splitting into 100 peoples as distinct from each other as the Greeks, Romans, Germans, and Slavs were. But just as we can learn a good deal about the primitive religion of these Americans, so the Indian tribes, which never became civilized, and therefore, not having gold or silver, were not blotted out by the Christian invaders, show us, in the common features of their myths, a good deal of the early religion of America. Since these Indians came from Eastern Asia, we shall naturally expect some resemblance of their religious ideas to those of the Mongolians, which we have described. There is, in fact, a considerable resemblance, apart from the Yanagans of Terra del Fuego and a few tribes of the Brazilian forest, which represent the original population of America and show us the very beginning of religion, as I explain in The Origin of Religion, Little Blue Book number 1008. There is a common body of beliefs. These beliefs are seen at their most primitive level amongst the Eskimo, a branch of the invading race which went north into the Arctic region, and in their isolation made no further progress. They have the usual idea that the world is full of spirits of the dead, and that, as large numbers of these are malicious, it is necessary to pay medicine men to propitiate or defeat them. There is no worship, but certain spirits with special names are crudely credited with great power and may be regarded as demigods. The Indians of South America represent a higher level. There is, of course, the old belief that nature is full of the disembodied spirits of the dead, largely of a malicious nature, but even the lower Indians have gone on from this to regard everything in nature as animated, and this leads to the rich totems, which is so notorious a feature of Indian life. Every stone, tree, and animal had its animating spirit. There are no gods, but some spirits, an ancient one in the sky, our Father, the old woman, etc., are well on the way to become gods. The North American Indians show us a still higher level of religious evolution, and this is quite natural, since they remained in the path of migration and would experience more stimulating contact with other tribes. The souls of men survive, but they go to a land underground in the west. Even the souls, however, now have shadows, and these remain on earth to plague the living, a very curious confusion of the earlier and the later idea of the soul. Animism is universal, and the practice spreads of trying to get possessed of the virtue, the medicine of special objects in nature. The major spirits are now still greater, though one would hesitate to call them gods. There is a Lord of life, a creator who lives in the sun, and an old woman who never dies, in the moon. One might insist that the former is a god, if not a supreme being, but some tribes believe that he makes rain or snow by scratching his buttocks. You may, if you like, call that a belief in a god. Sorry, I had to pause the video because I forgot to turn the notifications off on my phone. All right, here we go. Animism is so conspicuous in the American religions that some writers have taken it as the starting point of all religion, but it is far too abstract of an idea for the mind of a primitive savage. We show in the origin of religion that 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 religion begins with a belief in definite concrete souls or shadows. The imagining of such souls in nature comes later, and the Indians are at a relatively high stage of development. In time, branches of this Indian race rose to the level of civilization, and we find religion, as usual, rising in the same proportion. Probably the Mayas were the first branch to become civilized. Explorers on the spot told me that they have found no trace of Mayan civilization older than the first century BC, and that the cities which have been excavated belong generally to a period from the 5th to the 13th century of the present era. Unfortunately, the Mayas had been conquered and driven south before the Spaniards reached America, and we have not so good a knowledge of their religion in its pure form, especially as we cannot decipher their writing. But sufficient is known to show us that there was a normal development from the Indian level. I opened my little book on the existence of God, the futility of belief in God, little blue book number 1060, with a sketch of a sacred pool in Yucatan in which maidens were sacrificed. But human sacrifice was not a general feature of the Maya cult. It had its gods of the winds, the rain, the cardinal points, all nature gods developed in the way we have so often seen, and gods of the harvest, an evolution of the usual fertility god or goddesses, of war and of birth and death, which the mind in its advance commonly adds to the older nature spirits. The belief in multitudes of spirits remained, but the great gods had imposing temples and most powerful priesthoods. The chief priest, with hereditary office, was next to the king, and round these the whole life of the people was compelled to revolve. There were, however, two defied national heroes, or ancestors, who were very prominent in the cult, and one of these, Kulakan, was said to have forbidden human sacrifices. The story itself indicates that they had once been common, though the civilized Mayas, with their elaborate calendar and astronomy and feudal systems, had outgrown them. But they were still practiced in parts, and at Chichen Itza, the city of the sacred pool which I described, hundreds of maidens would give themselves up for sacrifice in time of great stress. It is natural to find that in Peru, which was sheltered from the constant waves of invaders from the north, this civilization was, in many respects, carried to a still higher level. In respect of religion, however, Peru shows us a melody of all stages in the evolution of religion. The mass of the people clung to animism, fetishism, and totemism, and had a god spirit for every family. Most prized of all were the local spirits of vegetation. The official religion had, as usual, developed the greater nature gods into creators and rulers of the universe, with wonderful shrines and golden images. Other gods, such as those of water and fertility and of thunder, still lingered. Human sacrifices were very rare, but not unknown. In many years, the deified sun was the great god, and whole nunneries of virgins dedicated themselves to him. In the north, upon which less civilized peoples continuously swept from the further north, the civilization was less advanced, or rather, there were many separate civilizations which are still a puzzle to the archaeologist. Most prominent were the Toltecs from about the 7th to the 12th century, and the well known Aztecs from the 13th to the 16th century. It is now disputed if there was such a race as the Toltecs, but a race to which that name clings spread over Mexico and left magnificent ruins of cities there. The chief god was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered snake. The creator, known in historic times as the wind god, but believed to have been originally a moon god. As, however, the old legends made Quetzalcoatl a famous king of the Toltecs, a reformer who abolished human sacrifice, we may have a deified ancestor and several nature gods rolled into one. That is what we often find. With him was associated Tetzalcoatl, originally the waxing moon, who became an all-seeing ethical god and punisher of sin. In short, we find the old nature god of sun, moon, wind, water, etc., now confused with fertility gods of the earth and ethical gods of moral control. This is the normal development of religion and of humanity. A swarm of spirits and cult of ancestors at the first level, a veneration for the sun and moon and fire and winds and water at the next level, a great concern about futility gods and rain gods in a dry country when man develops agriculture, and at last, when cities and social life develops, a development of ethical gods and a sense of sin. The Aztecs, who came later from the uncivilized north, naturally mingled primitive features with the civilization they borrowed. Their intense veneration of the sun shows that this was the chief part of the original religion, and of human sacrifices, they were the most prodigal of any. The moon, the morning star, and the principle of fertility also represent older deities, but the god of war becomes becomes of supreme importance to so warlike a people. In fact, gods of sun and moon, wind and rain, fire and thunder now get thoroughly mixed up with attributes of creation and punishment of sin. We must, however, not suppose that the Aztecs were so bloody as the religion of their priests. Sober, honest people of tender sensibility, governed by laws of a high moral standard, one of the chief's authorities calls them, and this Christian writer adds, vices such as drunkenness and untruthfulness arose with the misery and slavery of the Spanish times. In some respects, the Aztecs throw a flood of light on the evolution of religion. They developed ocular confession, communion, the cross, aesthetic bodies of priests, monks, hermits, and austere nuns. In fact, so many Catholic features that the Spaniards invented a story that St. Thomas had preached the truth to them 1,000 years before they existed. That's the end of chapter 5. And hydrate. And now we'll move on to chapter 6, the final chapter. Chapter 6, Religion in Persia and Palestine. The Christian reader who is not familiar with modern thought will wonder why I here take together two religions which he would not dream of connecting. He will understand that I am not for the moment attempting to give them equal importance and allotting them the same space. A separate booklet is specially devoted to the Hebrews and their Bible. But he may be surprised that two religions between which he does not see the slightest connection should be squeezed together into one short chapter. Well, he will see the connection presently. If he has forgotten that it was under the kindly rule of the Persians that the Hebrews restored their kingdom and wrote their Bible, and if he does not know that some of the later books of the Old Testament are practically Persian literature. Indeed, he may already have realized that religions are more closely connected than he had suspected. The progress of religion through the ages is like that of a great river which receives countless tributary streams from different countries. Thus, the Hebrew religion, as it is written in our actual Old Testament, very plainly, as we shall see, reveals its debt to Babylon, Egypt, Persia, and Greece. It opens with familiar Babylonian legends and closes with light skepticism of the Greek. A book on the New Testament shows further contributions from Persia. Other books will show all this in detail. Here, I have to give only an outline. We have already seen who the Persians were, from the region of Asia Minor, where the Hindu-Persian branch of the Aryan family dwelt, while the European branch seems to have lived, during the Ice Age, in the region of the Caucasus. The early Persians moved to the mountains north of the Mesopotamian plain. There, for 1,000 years, they remained an obscure pastoral people with a primitive nature worship, like that of the early Hindus. Gradually, the brilliant civilizations of Babylon and Assyria, down by the great rivers, fired their rulers with ambition, and the fall at, at last of Nineveh and Babylon left the world throne vacant for them. In the Persian sacred books, clumsily known as the Zend Avesta, though the phrase really means commentaries law, we have the usual falsification by later priestly writers of the early history. In the first stage, we find the familiar belief in innumerable spirits of the house and village, the commune and province, of the water, land, and cattle, the Avesta says, and a marked cult of ancestors. They are, as usual, both good and bad, and they soon evolve into angels and devils in the Persian religion. Then there are gods or great nature spirits, chief of whom is the sky god Mithra, with other deities as in Hindu religion. In its later development, Persian religion differs materially from Hindu and is a most interesting illustration of natural religious evolution in relation to environment. The descendants of the hardy warriors who had crossed Asia yielded to the fiery embrace of the sun in the tropical soil of India. Their Persian cousins remained in the cool and sobering mountains, and the sterner life begot an early moral idealism. The chief advance is associated with a great prophet named or Zoroaster, who is believed to have lived, some doubt if there ever was such a person, about the 6th or 7th century BC. Once more, in other words, there was, as in India and China, and we will add Greece, a great ethical and religious stride onward, 5 or 6 centuries before Christ. It is of the most piquant pieces of irony of Friedrich Nietzsche that he put one of his most famous deliverances of morality in the mouth of the prophet Zoroaster, for the Persian was a moralist of the most austere description. In the old Persian religion, certain demigods or heroic spirits, partially deified ancestors probably, were recognized, and amongst these was Ahura the Wise or Ahura Mazda. In the Zoroastrian reform, Ahura Mazda became the supreme, practically the one god, for other spirits of the new religion were rather in the position of Christian archangels. The old belief, like the Egyptian, that the soul survived death and was rewarded for its virtues was strengthened, and a code of the severest virtue, especially sexual virtue, was set up. But Zoroaster faced the problem of evil more candidly than any other religious thinker. There must, he said, be an enormously powerful evil principle with legions of minor devils. Ahura Mazda lets him have a long run, but a time will come, the kingdom of heaven, or of Ahura Mazda, the Avesta repeatedly calls it, when God will destroy the world by fire, silence the evil spirit, judge all men, condemn the wicked to suffer in the fire, and reward the good with eternal bliss. If any man can see no connection to this belief with the teaching of the Christ, who came 5,000 years later, he is hard to convince. But there is one vast difference. In Persian religion, the wicked suffer only for a time. They were purged or purified. In the end, all men enjoyed heaven. It can hardly be said that Christ improved the myth. The Parsis of India maintained this old Persian religion in a fairly pure form. They are not fire worshippers, but they see in that purifying element a great symbol of spiritual purification. Purity, particularly sexual, was the main Persian ideal, but the presence of the large body of Zoroastrians so far from their country reminds us that the reformed religion suffered a customary fate. It degenerated, and eventually it was supplanted by Mohammedanism. Mohammedanism. In the meantime, there was another development of a very great interest. Ahura Mazda, the great judge, fell into a secondary position, and the popular sky god Mithra returned to supremacy. But Mithra evolved rapidly, as all gods do when their worshippers evolve. Babylonian influence made Mithra a definite sun god, instead of a vague sky god, and, on the other hand, the ethical development both in Persia and Babylon invested him with a new character. Mithra succeeded to the place of Ahura Mazda as the great guardian of purity, and a new religion, Mithraism, was given to the world. It spread over the Roman world at the same time as Christianity, and far more rapidly, and was in so many respects like Christianity that the pagans maintained that the Christian church borrowed rites and doctrines from it. Mithra, whose birthday in a cave was annually celebrated on December 25th, the natural date for a sun god's birthday, as about that time the sun begins to rise or be born again, became the Savior of men, the Ram of God, who taketh away the sins of the world. The liturgy said, the shining pattern of virtue. His followers were baptized in blood and had to conform to an austere standard of virtue. Incense, candles, holy water, and linen-draped priests were features of the daily ceremonies. We shall see that the church had to get this powerful rival suppressed by force, and an even later Persian ethical religion, Manichaeism, will also be described when we come to early Christian history. In another volume. 2. We tell of a religious reformer who arose and was executed in Persia in the 19th century, whose life and teachings are remarkably parallel to those of Christ. Let me repeat that all this is only a summary or sketch of what I have fully described and for which I have given all the authorities in my larger works, especially the growth of religion and the sources of the morality of the Gospels. In those works, the reader will find the titles and authors of the hundreds of works, all absolute authorities from which I derive my material. But all this, though so little known to the believer, is undisputed historical narrative. The religion of the Hebrews is, of course, treated in a special volume, and it is necessary here only to indicate its place in the general scheme. Let me urge the reader, as usual, to study a map, to learn the material conditions. Palestine is a small land so situated between the ancient kingdoms of their armies, and merchants crossed it for thousands of years. Babylon from the east, Egypt from the southwest, the Hittites from the north, the Phoenicians from the coast, and later the Persians, Greeks, and Romans. We now have very strong reason to know that the mysterious Philistines, with whom the early Hebrews were in contact, were actually refugees from Crete, bringing into Palestine, long before the time of Solomon, a culture already 3,000 years old. Pardon me. So there is no longer any mystery or miracle about the Jewish religion. As our scholars trace their history, the Hebrews were hardly civilized when about 1300 BC they wandered over the desert from Mesopotamia to the confines of Syria. A few tribes may have gone as far as the fringe of Egypt, but there is no historical trace whatever of a body of Hebrews in Egypt. Their tribal god, Yahweh, seems then to have been a sky or thunder god of a type with which we are familiar. The oldest books of the Old Testament are known to be the early prophecies of Amos and Hosea. Many a devout reader must have been puzzled by the low moral standard in many respects of those and other early books. It is leagues below that which we shall find in Egypt, Babylon, and Persia. Now the reason is clear. This is the real beginning of Hebrew literature, not deuterometry and the Golden Rule, and the influence of surrounding civilizations on the pastoral hill people is only commencing. In the 7th and 6th century, a fresh and more advanced batch of prophets arises, and then the whole nation is carried off to Babylon. The Persians released them and earned their gratitude. It was then, in the 5th century, that the priests compiled the Old Testament as we have it, falsified the early history, and crudely wielded the whole literature from a sacred book of Yahweh. But all this we shall see in detail later. It is enough here to show how natural a place Hebrew religion occupies in the general scheme, how its legends and doctrines are found in earlier civilizations, and how it came in contact with these. The next phase in the great evolution is Christianity, but we have first to see how, in preparation for it, nature religion developed its ethical religion in Europe itself. Ooh, I forgot this has 8 chapters, this book. So we're going to stop right there because that is the end of chapter 6. So this will be the end of video number 3 or part 3 of Little Blue Book number 10. Yeah, number 10. Number 1030. Oops. Titled The World's Great Religions. Written by Joseph McCabe. Copyright around 1926. All right, thanks for listening, and join me in part 4.